Since at least the 1990s, there has been an explosion of Scottish and Irish heritage festivals across the South. These celebrations allow interested folks to gather and share their appreciation for art, music, and storytelling. The Scottish Highland Games variety is popular because of people's interest in learning about kilts, Highland clans, and the romanticized landscapes that contain the remains of their ancestors. Games are held during the warmer months of the year. The most popular Highland events include those held annually at Stone Mountain, Georgia, and Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina. They attract over 100,000 visitors to their weekend activities. Highland Games have also been held at Radford, Virginia, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Jackson, Mississippi, Glasgow, Kentucky, Montgomery, Alabama, Batesville, Arkansas, Arlington, Texas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, as well as Charleston, South Carolina. Many people who attend these games are keenly interested in genealogy, so clan tents are set up to serve their need for information. I enjoyed being in those tents and feeling as though a family reunion was taking place. It was a beautiful thing to behold. However, despite the growing popularity of Highland festivals, many Southerners of Irish, Welsh, or Scottish descent remain disinterested or uninformed about their heritage. Here's a shocker for some Americans. Despite the respect that we might have for modern-day Scotland and Ireland and their citizens, many of them don't know much about the demographic history of their own people. They confuse citizenship, let's say I'm a citizen of Scotland, with heritage and DNA. That has to be understood because there are histories of political units called countries and histories of nations that are by definition people. People move across boundaries and oceans, but they take their DNA and culture with them. Perhaps due to that ignorance and a little snobbery, a good many European people express amusement that Americans are so interested in their genealogies. By the way, the same could be said for how Native Africans view African Americans. A Nigerian once told me that he sees African Americans as ne'er-do-wells. Like Africans, most Europeans are born, live, and die in their ancestral lands, so it's easy for them to take for granted the closeness of the places that played important roles in their family and ethnic histories. About 25 years ago, I was fortunate to hold an honorary teaching fellowship at the University of Dundee in Scotland. While I was conducting my first lecture in a course called Scotland and the Americas, thanks Tony Parker if you're watching, I really will always appreciate you. He was my boss there. A student asked me if white Americans came from Europe. Upon hearing the question, I surveyed the room, looking at the expressions of the 100+ faces staring back at me. I fully expected to see smiles of incredulity everywhere, but instead I saw looks of curiosity as the students sat motionless, waiting for my answer. And thinking of a thoughtful response to the student's question, I remembered a situation that occurred in Oklahoma a few years earlier when a waitress in the cafe asked the folks sitting at my table a question. She asked, "Are yuns ready to order?" I recalled after hearing her query, I blurted out, "You said yuns," which was a word commonly used in my part of southern Appalachia. To which she replied, "Yes, that's an Okie word." Taking that event in Oklahoma as an opportunity to use as a teachable moment, I returned to the Scottish student who had asked the question. "Well," I said, "yes. White people in America have roots in Europe." I then told the class about my experience in Oklahoma and the lady's use of the word yuns. That had relevance to them because yuns and similar pronunciations like yins and other words like hankering were used in Scotland from at least the 17th and 18th centuries. Later, migration flows carried those words across Pennsylvania and the American South and into rural Oklahoma, where my waitress defended the word as quintessentially Oklahoman in origin. Both the students and the waitress shared at least one cultural trait, but they had no idea others living across the Atlantic shared it with them. At a small shop catering to tourists in Gretna Green, Scotland, I came across, which is just across, by the way, the border with England, a clerk told me that she thinks Americans are more Scottish than those who live in Scotland. She told me that she wears a kilt to work, but never wears one away from the job. I don't know why she would. Anyway, at a restaurant in Bath, England, or Bath, England, I had a long conversation with a lady who owned the place and the adjoining inn. After I told her that some of my students and I were looking forward to seeing Scotland and the border country from which so many of our ancestors had immigrated, she laughed and said, "I think it's so fascinating that you Americans fancy that you are part of our history." With a look of disbelief on my face, I advised her that we are and you are part of ours. I explained to her that the history of our people did not begin in 1776 or even back in 1607 at Jamestown. I told her that when Mary Queen of Scots was on her troubled throne and Elizabeth I reigned over England, Ireland, and Wales, our ancestors paid homage to them, for the queens were their sovereigns and your ancestors were their kin. The lady politely smiled at me, mirrored my look of disbelief, and went on with her chores, shaking her head from side to side. At the end of the day, Americans who travel abroad in search of ancestral roots are not likely to find a warm welcome from distant kin. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone if some ill-informed person laughs at them and calls them granny chasers. I have to say that I experienced less of that kind of treatment in Ireland, but there are those still on the Emerald Isle who wonder why Americans can't accept the fact that they are just Americans without hyphens. In a country where most people look like they could be their cousins, which is or was the case in northern Great Britain and Ireland until recent years, when they've allowed unfettered immigration to come in, they can't fathom the physical size and ethnic diversity of the United States. They have no basis for understanding that ethnic islands and ethnic neighborhoods have formed and functioned in America since the 1700s and 1800s. They have no idea that there are more people who share their DNA that live outside of the homeland than there are who live in it. Let me close with this thought. It's important to distinguish between ethnic history and the history of a country. Most of us are taught about a country's history and only regard racial minorities as having an ethnic history. All one has to do is visit an Italian, Ukrainian, or Polish neighborhood, the Scots-Irish culture area of the southern Appalachian region, or the Spanish influences in Florida and southwest of the United States, to observe the short-sightedness of that perspective. There are European ethnicities and cultures. There's not just one. Thanks for joining me today. God bless you and yours. Bye-bye.